So, as far as the Irish election itself went, uh, the election in December ended with Fianna Fáil, uh, the main capitalist party, getting 48 seats, Fine Gael getting 38 seats, and Sinn Fein getting 39. And these were, although all three parties saw increased numbers of seats because of a change in the regulations, in actual fact, their votes fell. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's fell slightly, and Sinn Féin's fell quite sharply by about over 5%. So that left the capitalist government with 86 seats, and a majority is 88. And what they did then was co-opt a group of radical independents. And the radical independents are basically the debris of earlier members of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And usually they're outside of those parties because they're the most corrupt elements of those people. This group, which isn't really a group, it's a collection of independents, managed to get Veronica Murphy in as the speaker. And then they were given junior places in the government structure. And then they've asked for opposition talks as well. The main character involved in this is a guy called McAnulty, who has a conviction for tax offences and was invited to resign from the Dail, but who declined. So that's the background. And as a result of this, usually the Irish government consists of recent Irish governments are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and some minor party is the meat and the sandwich, either Labour or the Greens. But when you're the meat and the sandwich, you get devoured the next election. People are more likely to blame you. And the Greens were devastated in this election. And as a result of this manoeuvre, we now have the most right-wing government in a generation, I would say, maybe 2 generations. What's happened then is Sinn Féin have now started to reposition themselves on the left, but in a very timid way. You know, for example, there's a row about so-called Irish neutrality as Ireland jumps into NATO and European militarism with both feet. And Sinn Féin are calling for a referendum to assert our neutrality. There's a level of cooperation with the lefties and with the other opposition parties, but unfortunately, it's over Dail procedure. People are complaining because this ragtag and bobtail group are being offered both membership of the government and opposition speaking rights, and they want to preserve their own speaking rights, but there's no sign at all of any thoughts of mobilisation or operating outside the Dáil. So that's nearly all I have to say about Ireland, to tell the truth. That's just the background, because the rest of it sort of strays back towards geopolitics, or at least towards leftism in general. This sort of idea of a left government, of a collaboration with lots of parties from very different positions. It didn't start in Ireland. So it has a history. The main history, at least in my experience, starts with the collapse of the USSR. And the people who, I won't say they theorized this, but they documented the most, was the leadership of the Fourth International. So you saw the collapse of the USSR, and you saw following that a collapse of European communism into Eurocommunism, a collapse of social democracy. And the Fourth International theorized a space to the left. So it said, what's happening here is all these structures and organizations have collapsed. The Social Democrats are racing to the right. That means there's a space to the left. And at the time, I quite disagreed with that. I thought, no, it means, the whole working class is in retreat, and we should accommodate that and not put in imaginary spaces. So the idea is that these spaces would be filled by broad left parties, and a number of broad left parties were set up. And there was a mechanism, and people can disagree with this, but I want to stress what I see this mechanism of being. The mechanism was that the left needed to unite. The revolutionaries needed to unite with reformists. But when they united, the political program they adopted was never to the left. It always went to the right. After a while, the other thing I want to add in there is that all of these new parties were very firmly based on electoral strategies. There was very little in the way of class organization or class mobilization. In Ireland, this was taken up very enthusiastically, and it was quite funny because a member of the Kieran Allen of the SWP used to come out with declarations. And the declarations were, we must learn to speak Scottish because there's a new Scottish Socialist Alliance. Now we must learn to speak French because there's the new NPA. And he says, we must learn to speak Greek because we have Syriza. And of course, all of these language lessons, when the currents they were endorsing failed, were followed by forgetfulness, because what lay behind this, and it's a long-standing trait of the Irish left, was opportunism. People are going in this direction. They're enthusiastic about it. Maybe we can recruit. We'll endorse it too. It didn't work. Forget about it and move on to something else. A problem arose after a while, and the problem was that clear possibilities for this alliance started to run out. So perhaps the most self-evident of those was the formation of the NPA. Because essentially, the group that formed it was the French section of the Fourth Nation, the LCR, but it didn't really have anybody to unite with. So what it did was it united with its own supporters in the expectation that, you'd get a surge, mass mobilization. Instead, everything went in the other direction. And you have the NPA, but without the politics of the LCR. And in Ireland, you had Peak Before Profit, which was partly these SWP cooperating with its own supporters. And it was also, to some extent, an electoral alliance with the old Socialist Party and one or two other individuals. And again, uh, uh, there wasn't anybody outside this quite small jumble of leftists. So the theory that was evolved was the theory of a left government. So the PBP, who by the way didn't have a socialist program, it was very much a reformist organisation, was going to collaborate with Sinn Fein, and the electoral balance of Sinn Fein and the leftists would produce a majority. And one of the big difficulties of that, of course, is that Sinn Féin is not a socialist organisation. It's not within a million miles of being a socialist organisation. It's seen as somewhat leftist, but in the south. But what that means, nobody seems quite sure. And the big outcome of that strategy was that Sinn Féin were not able to put forward. They weren't able to walk a tightrope. So there were two big tightropes. One of the tightropes was the housing crisis. So they said they had the housing crisis is really acute. The housing markets controlled by the government in the interests of transnational companies and investors. They're guaranteed 4% a year. New property is bought for rent, and as a result, rents add up to well over half people's salary, and the opportunity for buying a house is very limited indeed. So Sinn Féin said they had an answer to that, but it was never quite clear what that answer was. And coming up towards the election, the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald, said, "We will cap house prices at €30,000 per house in Dublin." And the government struck back and said, "That's just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. You couldn't afford it, and it would just cause a collapse in house values and also cause a collapse of the banks and so on." And actually, the government won that argument. The other thing that was a fairly crucial issue was there was a mobilization of the far right against migrants. And the government in Ireland did exactly what Keir Starmer did in Britain. It opposed racist demonstrations on the grounds of law and order. And then as the election was approaching, it launched a fairly savage repression of migrants and buggered them up into tents up in the mountains and tightened up on entry routes and that sort of thing. And Sinn Féin sort of got caught on the hop, because up to then their members were fairly pro-migrant, were against the oppression of migrants. But some of them started to drift over towards the right, and Sinn Féin moderated the position to accommodate that. None of it worked. It turned out in the elections, what we saw in the elections is the far right, although they established a presence, it's quite a small presence. The threat of migrants comes from the Irish government, but people tend to ignore that. Okay. So they'd run into some difficulty before that, because they'd been seen as being pretty collaborationist on the Northern Executive. They'd sort of bowed and scraped to British royalty to establish their fitness for government. And um, as I say, the housing issue really came out very badly for them. Uh, uh, One other thing I want to mention is that they're part of the reassessment by the left. So, as far as the left were concerned, they one of the things they'd done is they had moved themselves towards Sinn Fein because it's what do you call it? It's I've forgotten the name. It's the multiple vote system. Um, so, in order to get elected, you need to do two things. You need to get a relatively small initial vote, and then you need to get transfers from other parties. So for the socialist groups, they needed to have a big enough base to get a vote, which didn't have to be very big. And then they had to persuade Sinn Fein voters to transfer to them. And that worked quite well for them. But in this election, where Sinn Fein were trying to maximise their own vote, the space left to transfer votes to the left was quite small. And in the end, there were three TDs elected. Two of them, one of them at the very end on a big surge of Sinn Fein transfers. There was one who had a pretty good vote and was going to get in anyway. And then there was one that got an old Labour Party vote. But it came very close to only one PBP candidate be elected. One other thing I want to put into this is that the lefties have claimed that they've done very well because of victories. And the victories they've claimed are victories in the water charges campaign that froze attempts by the Irish government to privatise the water services. They claim victory in the an abortion referendum that was successful, and they claim victory in a gay rights referendum that allowed gay marriage. And they said that was the basis on which their vote was increasing. In fact, the water charges was very spontaneous, and its main leadership was the trade unions, not only sections of the trade union. The abortion, essentially, the left went for a popular front because what they decided on the end was to endorse the government proposal. And the government proposal on abortion was actually quite restrictive. It hasn't changed at all, and did leave working class people still in extreme difficulty. If you're middle class, you just paid, and that was that, But the opportunity to call for the right to choose was missed by most of them. And again, the gay marriage campaign was endorsed by the government, so there was nothing much to add to it. The left just sucked themselves into it. So, where does that leave us now? Well, the issue is we have this model. The model is broad, diffuse party, try and link up with other parties, whether they're left-wing or socialist or not. uh, gain parliamentary representation, broaden the parliamentary representation, and maybe someday form a left government. And you know, that seems, just a lot of things would militate against that. It failed in this instance, and the idea that we can return to it is quite slight because, as I say, there are a couple of things coming up that have come up for Sinn Féin that they haven't been able to deal with. They do not have an answer to the housing crisis. They are dodging and moving to the right to a certain extent on the question of migrants. And they're going, although they haven't yet, they will run into serious trouble in the north because the Northern Executive, although it has been reformed, and there is a level of cooperation about sharing out the spoils, the institutions are just there to paper over sectarian differences and to share out patronage and money and so on. So that means that the local administration this last week published a programme for government, but it contains no details, nothing at all in it. The two parties don't cooperate at that level. They don't have a common programme. So one of the big crisis areas is health, but there's no plans to deal with it. They're hoping that the British will give them more money. The main source of water in the north, Loch Ness, has been massively polluted, but there are no serious plans for resolving that, and no money and no bodies. So Sinn Féin are going to get tarred with not the collapse, but the growing decay of the peace process in the north. So what's the alternative? The alternative is a political economy of the country that you're living in, a class analysis, and a praxis. So I'll say something about those things. Well, let me start off globally, right? No, not. I'll do this short thing first and try and finish quickly. So, political economy of Ireland is that the northern part of the country remains a colony. Although there's a local administration, it's ruled over by the British. In the south, you have a semi-colony or a neo-colony. You have a comprador bourgeoisie who rule in the interests of big business, finance capital, inward investment, European and American. And this is so extreme that the Irish economy can be divided into two bits. There's the transnational economy, and there's the local economy. And the transnational economy is the bigger bit. The head of the business organisation remarked recently before the elections that people were talking about a 6 billion surplus that Ireland had gained because of its low rate of corporation tax. But he said that was the wrong figure. People shouldn't be talking about the 6 million surplus that maybe they could do this and that, but they should be talking about the 10 billion that was absolutely necessary to balance the Irish budget. So the Irish budget had to be written to make sure we got this 10 billion, and the 10 billion came from a handful of companies that operated in Ireland. The last thing I want to mention is praxis. That is normally the way Marxists approach things. you have a theorization, and then you see what the working class do. Uh, Now, that's not that's sort of really fairly realistic when the workers are advancing, but when they're in retreat, it's hard to do a practice. It's hard to say, well, we thought the workers would revolt about this, but they didn't. Uh, uh, in Ireland, so the defeats that occurred, as I said before, the USSR, followed by social democracy, but in large areas of the world, the big retreat was of national liberation movements, uh, which, without the support of the USSR, adopted various peace processes. One of the most famous is the South African one, and the Irish peace process was based on the South African model. But these were all the South African one was the best because the population got the vote, but all the other ones were essentially pacification. And so you've got this peace movement in Ireland, which is almost unquestioned, but it essentially means the triumph of imperialism and capitalism and the removal of class struggle to replace with identity politics. The problem in the North is some sort of argument between Catholics and Protestants. The British imperialists have nothing to do with it. They're the referees. And the big defeat that came before the peace process was a process called partnership, where the trade union movement agreed in advance with the government the conditions for public sector paying conditions. And this has been going on for maybe 30 years. And as a result, the trade unions are very well integrated into government cooperation. So I'll end up the main. So we've got the issue of housing, which is not going to be resolved. In fact, it's an issue. It's an international issue. As more and more private finance turns to squeezing rents out of workers. And in Ireland, so you've got the racism thing, which is, as I said, it's essentially progress by the state, and the last thing is, and the major thing is that Ireland is moving the Irish government in full view and almost without protest is integrating itself into NATO, integrating itself into the rising EU military structure, manages to dance around weeping tears about Gaza, but never ever doing anything practical that would upset the Europeans or Americans. And there's really no protest. The big problem, because of the weak nature of the left, the big problem is people keep appealing to Ireland's neutrality. But that's just a way of whispering in the wind. One of the major US military bases in Europe is Shannon Airport, which has been open for years. It transported people to the torture centres in Iraq and in Europe. It carries bombs and missiles by the plane load. It's loaded up with troops, and nobody ever talks about it, right? Nobody ever talks about it. The problem is that we're a dependent country, and people know that. Very recently, Ireland received 14 billion, part of a scam it had worked with Apple to avoid tax. And the money was actually stolen from European workers. But it ended up being given to the Irish because the European court wanted it sorted out and didn't want Apple to get it. But when that dispute was on, a majority of the population supported the government in attempting to refuse this money. So people know that the country is dominated by transnational groups, and they don't see any alternative. So how can we change that? Well, I think my own opinion, I'm just speaking roughly now, I think the main thing is tenant rights. People are calling for public housing. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not going anywhere. There's no mechanism for public housing. The whole Irish housing structure is privatised. But there is a place for tenant rights. And if I could just mention, as I get towards the end, last year there was a freeze on rent increases and a freeze on no-fault evictions. And the government decided that this was slowing down housing growth. So they took away the no-fault evictions, which means that the landlord can give any excuse and tell you to leave your rented property. There are no tenant rights. And there was a complaint in the Dail, a demonstration by the left in the Dail, and after that, nothing. There have never been any further protests in support of tenants because people are no longer confident about building these organisations, and their eyes are all focused inside the Dail. The other thing that has to be taken up is the fight against privatisation, because this is going to lead and is leading to major problems, especially in the health service, where again everything is privatised. And not only that, but large companies are brought in to build structures. There's no real supervision, so a hospital could start off costing 50 million and still being built at a cost of 500 million with no complaint and no overview. And finally, the government's position on NATO and on Gaza needs to be challenged, and that needs to be done in terms of operational things, not just march. You know what tends to happen here is people march up and down, but there are really no demands. You know, it's sort of we support Gaza, but there's no attempt to stop the government. As long as the government sort of keeps up a squad of tears, that's enough. And certainly one of the things that the Irish government intends to do right now, for example, is to invest in combat aircraft. It's just sent radar systems to Ukraine. It's doing away with a thing called the triple lock, where it asks the UN Security Council to agree that it should send troops around the world. So this thing's happening apace. Last thing, those are the sort of ideas. How do we make them a reality? Well, of course we need a political party. And as Jonathan said at the start, things are a bit better in that at least some people are accepting that the parliamentary road is more or less a dead end, and they're discussing about the sort of programme that we should have. But it's not a question of just the party. You know, we need a lot more. We need an environment that a party could exist in, and that means we need lots of discussion groups. we need research groups, and we need action groups. And some of those things all exist. They're scattered all over the place, but hopefully, you know, the fact that we've come to the end of one lane may lead to another. I'll stop there. I've talked for far too long.